The following is a presentation of the Six Arrows Radio Network.
On this episode, we have Paul Cowley, KB7VML, giving us an after-action report on amateur radio's role in Operation Stable Mercury with the Iowa National Guard. This is the Ham Radio 360 Field Radio Podcast. This show is brought to you by Chameleon Antenna, versatile, dependable, stealth, and built to last. I'm your host, John Jacobs, W7DBO, Whiskey 7 Delta Bravo Oscar. I'm a third-generation amateur radio operator, and I reside in Utah. If this is your first time hearing this show, thank you for clicking and tuning in. This show is part of the Ham Radio 360 network. This show releases every other Thursday, and The Workbench with George and Jeremy releases the opposing Tuesdays. Kale with the HR 360 show releases the Tuesday before this show, but he is on a sabbatical until the new year. You can find our show notes and links on the web at fieldradiopodcast.org. Also be sure to check out our YouTube channel for expanded content not included in the podcast. By way of news, I was honored to be a guest on the Everything Ham Radio podcast with Curtis K5CLM that will air next week. We discussed the WhisperNet and how it can be used at home and in the field. Curtis is a great friend of the Ham Radio 360 family, and his show now releases on the opposing Thursdays of this show. So in off weeks, enjoy the Workbench show on Tuesdays and the Everything Ham Radio show on Thursdays. You can find more information about his show at everythinghamradio.com. Also this week, I got a couple items from West Mountain Radio. I've been a longtime user of their Rig Runner and PowerGate. This time I got their battery analyzer and a power check. I'm running these through the paces this week, and look to YouTube for a review release soon. These are two great tools in the toolbox to understand your power consumption and battery performance in the field. Our guest on this episode is Paul Cowley, KB7VML, who participated in a communications exercise with the Iowa National Guard. I originally connected with Paul on Facebook over some ideas on masting and antenna in the field. We started discussing his group's participation in the exercise, and there was such good information we made it into its own episode. Paul in this episode gives us an after-action report on amateur radio's role in a communications exercise, the equipment they used, and the lessons learned. We'd like to welcome to the show Paul Cowley from Iowa, KB7VML. Welcome to the show, Paul.
Thanks, John. Thanks for the invitation to join and talk a little bit about the fun stuff of antennas.
Yeah, thanks for willing to come on. You're an extra class operator, and
Yes.
Why don't you give us just a quick little history of your ham radio career, I guess, and what you do locally.
Okay, great. I was first licensed in 1993, just out of high school. I had a buddy who we would go build airplanes, model airplanes in his house and play on 10 meters periodically, and he finally pushed me over the edge and said, hey, your uncle's licensed and you don't need code anymore, and maybe you ought to go ahead and just get your license. So the rest is kind of downhill from there. Locally, I'm the president of the Story County, we'll get the words out right, Amateur Radio Club here in Ames, Iowa. I also participate with the local ARES field structure as both an assistant EC in Story County and the district emergency coordinator covering about 16 counties in central Iowa. So very active there, help with a lot of different events in the region, and all in all, just have a lot of fun with the hobby, getting out and being in the field.
And so you mentioned in your the post you put on Facebook with the inoperability exercise. Do you want to talk about that for a minute?
Absolutely. The most recent exercise, the name of the exercise was Operation Stable Mercury. And as military stuff goes, they've got to have some fancy operation name in there. But it kind of made sense. Mercury was the messenger of the gods, and they wanted to stabilize communications after a large-scale weather event. That was the scenario behind this exercise. So we were invited, the Story County ARES group, as well as the Polk County ARES group, and several other folks that are kind of standalone who either have COML certifications or other credentials. So the exercise was sponsored by the Iowa National Guard, hosted by the Iowa National Guard, I should say, and then involved the Iowa Homeland Security and Emergency Management folks, and an opportunity to exercise our interoperability with public safety, military, and other organizations. It included Mars, it included some folks out of state, and a great opportunity for us to demonstrate the role that amateur radio can play. This was, I think, our fourth time participating, both as a standalone organization and in conjunction with our local emergency management agency.
So what role did you play in that? It was a secondary communication role, and what kind of traffic did they ask you to pass?
We were passing several different types of traffic, some on VHF and UHF, both simplex and repeaters locally. We also were passing HF traffic to distant stations in Missouri, Iowa, and Kansas, pieces of traffic related to the exercise at the time on the HF stuff, just to, there were various injections to prove the loop back. So the message included a piece of traffic to contact the sender via cell phone that it had actually been received. We also passed exercise traffic that was related to the scenario, various needs outside the critical public safety stuff, such as we need certain numbers of cots or beds or whatever in a given situation.
Was this voice mode or digital mode or CW?
Primarily voice mode, and that was one of the items that came up in the after action report. Is they said, hey, voice mode's great, but we'd really like to do some digital stuff. And we had gone prepared to do digital, and we've done some digital stuff using, I don't know if you're familiar with the NBEMS, Narrowband Emergency Management System, I think is what it stands for, protocols. But we've played with some of that locally. Windley, we were prepared to use. All of our traffic was voice, but at the end they said, we'd really like to be able to pass data and forms. And we said, well, we can do that. And they looked at us kind of funny and said, we need to talk more. And there's another exercise coming up. They've typically done in the fall, the exercises in the fall, and there's a scenario coming up. They're changing the timing to a spring exercise to fit in with some of the other players in the exercise. So I think there's an opportunity for us coming up in April to demonstrate some of the digital stuff that we can do as well.
Okay, so your M-Beams, M-Beams is really just like an agreed upon standard.
Yes.
You were running FLDigi.
Yep.
And then you were probably on the HF. Did you do it on HF and VHF also, or didn't they even attempt it?
We've actually done it primarily on VHF locally. We see that's really the role, is almost that last mile communication.
Yeah.
So Clint Miller, KC0JUO, is the EC for Story County here in Ames. He gave a presentation at our most recent club meeting about data modes in emergency communications, and he hit on that point real specifically, that it's that last mile communication and getting the message through that last mile that when communication systems are overwhelmed or down is going to be most important. So we're VHF. Sometimes we're simplex. We have tested over repeaters, and it works remarkably well to get across forms, everything from an ICS 213 form to we've actually got a custom form that we built with the help of Jason Scretta, KC0EDE locally, that is a situation report. So he took the PDF form that our emergency manager uses, converted that over to an HTML format, and we can then transmit data, populate that, and have it pop up as a web page that can then be printed by whomever is sitting in the EOC for a field situation report.
Yeah, and that's the nice thing with FLDigi is you can, as long as everybody has the same form in their custom form folder, you can transmit forms that way. And even if they don't have the form, you can send them the form first. And
right.
Then, and we've done some simplex stuff here with on VHF on the MT63 2K, I think is the mode we used. And it's a little bit longer than you would want for the repeater. You would run into a repeater timeout or a repeater ID. So we've mostly done that simplex. And the powerful thing about that mode, I don't know if you've used that mode or not, but you can voice couple your computers, or acoustic couple, I guess they say. You don't even have to have a sound card. If your radio is, and they even had it in the same comm trailer, as long as your radios your laptop microphone can hear the radio speaker, it decodes quite well.
Yeah, we actually, after the club meeting, held a little get-together, a demo. We didn't want to keep anybody any longer than they needed to, but it was, hey, if you want to see this stuff actually in action, stick around. And we did just that. One side of the room, and he's transmitting, and I'm on the other side with my HT held up to the computer, and boom, up pops the forum, populated and ready to go. It's pretty powerful stuff, and I think really has a niche that maybe hasn't been fully explored. I think it's Western Pennsylvania has really adopted it as a standard. We've taken a lot of their techniques to heart and used some of those principles to get things off the ground here locally.
Yeah, that's, I think, the most downloaded PDF file when you come to digital modes is their presentation. They have a couple of them out there saved to PDF. That's kind of where I've got that from too, was from them.
Yeah, it's pretty cool stuff. And like you say, that MT63, we use the long interleave format. I think that's the same standard that they're using. Has worked really well for us.
Yeah, and now HF not so much. I think they're trying to say standardize more on Olivia and different things like that, just because of the different characteristics of the band. So with your setup, first of all, how long did the exercise go? Was it?
This exercise was the first one that was multi-day, and that obviously introduces additional opportunities as well as some additional challenges. So up till now, they've all been a day. Roll in the morning at 7 or 8 o'clock, do the briefing, continue through the exercise, and go. This year was a 2-day exercise, so we had the briefing. They actually transferred us out into their training range. So they've got old buildings that are out there and various things, making it a lot more realistic than just setting up in a sports field or an open drill area. And had us split up into 6 different incident command posts that were simulating various areas around the Des Moines metro area. The scenario was a large scale tornado that had moved through and had damaged a significant amount of the infrastructure in the areas that it had impacted. So we were able to set up, continue the exercise the next morning. Obviously, that simulates more of the getting into a multiple operational period and how do you staff for that, and a lot of the opportunities to really think about that continuity of operations outside just a single test event.
And that's a valuable there, because a lot of times you'll have not necessarily tabletop exercises, but real life or real drill type scenarios, and it's everybody's home by dinner.
Right.
And you don't bring into the complexity of staffing and continuing operations or continuity of operations over multiple days.
Yeah, precisely. It adds a level of complexity as you're starting to look at equipment. Everything as simple as, how do you maintain charge on batteries? How do you secure equipment if you're not going to be there for the entire period? A little different on a military base, but you still have to give thought to those items there.
So speaking of that, what was your power structure for the event?
We had generator as backup. We've got a small Honda 2kW generator that goes with us just about everywhere. Most of the event we operated on a deep cycle AGM battery that's worked pretty well. That one's actually mine, but a gentleman here in our club just recently, W0BGM, Ben, has just recently purchased a nice lithium iron phosphate battery, LFP battery, and a pretty good sized power film solar panel to go with it.
Oh, wow.
And so we used that for part of the exercise just to prove it out and experiment with it a little bit. That was really I guess it would be its second real world exercise. We used it out on our solar eclipse QSO party. We took off out to western Nebraska and operated out in the field there and used that exclusively for that event. But
okay, so you said you had people in different rooms or different buildings simulating different groups. So did you have an operator in each room?
So they're looking at the broad scale of the operation. Polk County Aries was involved. They've got a trailer that they use as a mobile command center, if you will, and they were responsible for assisting with passing traffic, both real world to the operation, but primarily coordinating between each individual incident command post. So they had operators that were stationed at each location, and then the command post that was outside the exercise area. And then we were there, the Story County Aries group, just kind of drawing some lines there a little bit, was stationed at one of the specific incident command posts, playing more of an active role with HF communications in particular, but also relaying real-world I say real-world, but exercise world messaging out of the location. So there were really two groups, multiple nets, a lot of stuff going on, and that added to the complexity of it as well.
Okay, so how many stations did you have operating?
We had 2 stations up on HF. We had a box that had 2 additional radios for VHF, UHF capability, and then separate to that was the additional folks that were portable, taking care of that portion of the exercise. And that was all adjacent to public safety that was there with their equipment and their people as well. So,
okay. So you had those stations. How many operators did you have in constant manning?
We had 2 operators constantly at the table, one manning the VHF UHF station and one manning the HF station. And then as the exercises proceeded, we would check into various nets on both of those stations, and then there would be occasional injects of traffic that needed to be handled, messages that needed to be routed, or requests for support that needed to be handled as part of the exercise.
Okay.
So we were responsible. We made contact with National Guard units down in Missouri, with MARS stations in Kansas and Iowa and Missouri, and through most of this, well, actually all of that was on 60 meters, come to think of it. We were set up for 60 and 40 as well, but all of that was on 60 meters on the interoperability channels there. And so it was an opportunity for us to interface and make contact. Surprisingly, the military initially was not able to make contact even with themselves, and we were the only source of HF contact out of the exercise. That made us feel kind of happy and an opportunity for them to look at their antenna setups and say, okay, let's get rid of this system because it's not working for us. Let's put up a basic dipole, come back to the basics that they learned in their initial training, and get on the air and be successful with that as well.
Yeah, so you mentioned antennas. Let's talk about your HF antenna. So it was this in an NVIS type configuration, or were you full size?
Yeah, we were set up with I guess really 3 HF antennas. So off of one of the military mast sections that we were using, we had an inverted 4080 coil-loaded dipole in an inverted V configuration. And then separate from that, we had a 60-meter dipole set up for NVIS at 12 feet. So very low to the ground so that we're getting the full effect of the NVIS type propagation. And that was new for us. That was the first time that we had actually operated on 60 meters locally. I built the antenna on, I think, Saturday, and we tested it, Clint Miller and myself, and then we used it that coming Thursday. So good opportunity to prove out new capabilities that we didn't have before.
Yeah, that's interesting to hear that you were able to do that on 60 meters. Typically you hear it's it's 40 meter during the day and 80 meter at night. But you were successful on 60, and this was, like you said, you shut down at night. So this was a daytime 60 meter?
Yeah, daytime 60 meters. And we actually, part of the exercise included some additional training on HF. And we had a visitor come in, Mark English. He's the National Mars Coordinator. And then we had some additional folks out of Colorado Springs, Colorado, out of NORAD, Northcom there, and taught some information as far as propagation and looking at where that critical frequency lies. And surprisingly, I was the same way, 40 during the day, 80 at night. And that's what we'd always used and been successful with. But 60 meters falls right in that sweet spot and worked remarkably well for us.
Huh. I'll have to give that a try. I have a self-built 4080 that sits on the military poles. They kind of 40 goes off one side and 80 goes off other, so it's kind of like an X configuration.
Okay. That's very similar to what I've got.
So maybe I'm going to have to put 2 more in and cut it for 60 and make it a star or something like that, because that's interesting to hear 60 meter was working.
Yeah, possible. We got this down very low. It was a slightly droopy dipole. The research that we had done indicated that was an optimum configuration. And again, 12 feet off the ground, the signal's going almost straight up, and it worked surprisingly well for us.
What was the height of the bottom end of your dipole? Was it to the ground, or did you suspend it?
Yeah. So we just supported on the ends, stretched fairly tight. We used 3 sections of the military mast to do that, and then guide out in kind of a V off of each end. So we were probably at 10 and a half feet maybe, and then 12 feet on the ends. So there wasn't a lot of droop in it, but just a little bit. And then a piece of 8X down, and then RG8 back to the actual station. Okay.
And did you have a balun on that, or
no,
just straight with the tuner?
Yeah, just straight with the tuner, and it tuned up really well. It was a good real-world test of my antenna analyzer build that I'd built off the 360 Workbench podcast. It was in very close agreement with my friend's MFJ tuner, and we had to tune off the theoretical length. I think we ended up shortening it almost 3.5 feet in total.
Oh, okay.
So I think the total theoretical length is like 88 feet. I want to say it's 44 feet per side, and we ended up shortening it quite a bit, and that's the effect of being as close to the ground as it is.
Yeah.
Again, from the research that I've done. So it is important to get it dialed in, but once we did that, SWR was almost 1-to-1. We didn't even have to tune it because the feed point impedance is really close to 50 ohms.
Yeah, once you get with Invis, once you get that close to the ground, just tuning up, I mean, the ground is interacting so much with your antenna at that point.
Right.
You probably did have to bring that in quite a bit just to get it to tune up. Whereas if you probably would have had those same lines 30 feet in the air, you probably wouldn't have had to trim it up.
Yeah, exactly. The cool thing about 60 meters, and it didn't really ring to me until the class that we had attended there with Mars and Northcom, was that those 5 frequencies that we have available to us are really the one opportunity that we've got to be truly interoperable with FEMA, with the military, with all of the federal government agencies that are associated with emergency communications. So I don't think we give them as much credit or as much attention just because they're kind of that pariah out there, if you will. Channels, what are channels? We're used to being able to spin the VFO knob and end up on some odd frequency that's just adjacent to whomever's having a rag chew over there and establishing communication. So a little different world, a little different environment.
Yeah, and I believe, of course, someone will correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe we're secondary users on 60 meter, correct?
We are secondary users.
Okay,
so
and that is 60 meter isn't even normally used in. I don't think it's used in any contest, is it?
No, it's really not a contest band. It's we've got 40 and 80 to take care of that for us. We are secondary users, but it's an opportunity for us to develop, I will say, interoperable capabilities on HF, both regional through NVIS and potentially longer range with a little bit higher antenna reaching out, at least from our area out towards the coast, versus just being regional within a 3, 4, 5 state area.
Yeah, you mentioned Mars was interfacing with you. So was Mars on these same frequencies, or was Mars operating on their frequencies?
They were doing both. So just as we had our ham capability on 40 and 80, and most of the Mars guys are, in fact, if not all of them are ham guys anyway.
Yeah.
But they've got their own frequencies, and so they were overdoing their things with phone patches and that sort of thing. But we were interfacing with Mars stations operating under Mars authority on the interoperable channel as well. So we had FEMA, Homeland Security, we had the military, we had Mars, we had amateur, all coming together interoperable on the frequency. And we were kind of worried because that was about when Hurricane Irma was coming ashore, but we were able to use that second channel, channel 2, as it's designated, and conduct our exercise without interfering with any real world traffic.
And really channelized, there's so much freedom and so much non-standardization, I guess, in amateur radio. But I suppose standardized really helps because you don't have to spin the dial around. They're going to be in one of those spots, and you just need to try one, and if not, try the other. Did you use any type of software to find out what frequencies were working with each other?
We didn't. The Mars guys had quite a bit of stuff related to ALE.
Yeah.
ALE is something that I need to explore more of because there's a lot of capability there that I don't think we're tapping for long range communications.
Yeah, it was the ALE is what I kind of want to look at because we were trying at one of our last events before going through a remote temporary repeater for our FLDigi traffic. We just decided to play around and try NVIS on 40 and 80, just 40 really because it was during the day, but just trying to find a workable frequency. I think that ALE would have really helped in that when you're not standardized, but with 60 it sounds like it wouldn't be that beneficial.
Yeah, we've just got 5 channels there.
Yeah.
Fixed frequencies, whether you're looking at the dial frequency or the carrier frequency, and a single mode that or single sideband that we're dealing with there. So just something that, at least in my experience and locally, we haven't tapped very well. I think just because it's so different from our typical bands that we're used to working with.
So you mentioned you had some military people come in and give you some more information on propagation. What else did you figure out or what else did they tell you that you can tell us, I guess?
There wasn't anything special or classified there, that's for sure. But a lot of discussion of Mars and the role that they play. Discussion on a service called Shares. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that.
I haven't heard that yet.
Shares is federal and state stations that operate on frequencies that are allocated through NTIA. So there's 2 really regulatory bodies without getting off the tracks here too much. You've got the FCC that regulates us and commercial and all of the other services, and you've got the NTIA that regulates federal and military. And they can allocate frequencies and they coordinate between each other so that we're not issued the same frequency, or in some cases we are as primary and secondary in the case of 60 meters. But Shares is an auxiliary HF station that allows for message handling. They do a lot of work with ALE, WindLink, and basically it's an auxiliary HF system to allow for communications in a really bad day type environment between those organizations outside the normal channels of communications.
Okay. So you mentioned WindLink. Was that a tool you tried, or did you just stay with the N-beams?
We've played a little bit with WindLink. We've got the capability of it, but it wasn't part of the exercise here this time. So I think there's a real opportunity for us. We were in the debrief. The discussion was, hey, all of this voice traffic is useful. We'd really like to be able to do some digital stuff. How do we do that? And Clint Miller, the EC here out of Story County, raised his hand and said, "You guys know we can do that today," and they were kind of surprised with that. And we talked a little bit about it, and I think an upcoming exercise here in the spring will probably incorporate some form of digital message handling, whether that's WinLink or NBMS or whatever it happens to be.
Yeah, that's what I always say is served agencies, they want their email and they want their forms. And that's their world. I was starting to get interfaced with our county EOC, and that was his biggest thing was if our satellite system goes down or if everything goes down and we have to get that message, we have to get that email with the form to Denver, can you do it? And if you can, then you earned your seat at the table. Right.
And that's where we've been able to prove out that last mile communication through NBMS, either simplex or across repeaters, custom forms, and that sort of thing, handling that at a state level. They're looking at it and going, "Oh, we didn't know that you could do that." And it gives us an opportunity, I think, to demonstrate our capabilities. And at the end of the day, it's all about providing redundancy and backup in that really bad day scenario.
Yeah. So your VHF, UHF, what antennas did you use for that?
The VHF, UHF, we use a broadband antenna. I believe it's the Comet CA2X4, I think it is. It's designed to be very broadband, so it will actually work in the land mobile, in the ham, in the commercial, and not a great gain antenna, but a very broadband usable antenna. And we put that over an MFJ ground plane kit so that it's got something to work against. So It's intended as a screw-on mobile type antenna, and we'll put that up on top of a mast section. With the radios that we've got in the boxes that, again, were funded by our county emergency manager, we have some commercial radios in there that allow us to work on some of the interoperable frequencies. So I don't know if you're familiar with the NIFOG, the National Interoperability Field Operations Guide. There's frequencies in there that are spelled out for certain interoperable operations. And because these are commercial radios, we've programmed those frequencies in, and that provides some interoperability there. But we also need the broadband ability instead of just a regular ham antenna. And so that's what we've used for our VHF, UHF primarily.
Yeah, because having to change those antennas right in the middle of an exercise, or you just have to start being a porcupine, as David Goldenberg would say. You have to start putting up one of everything.
Exactly, and that's always an option, but we found that the broadband antennas for the work that we do works pretty well. Now, it was interesting. We visited, there was a social event at the end of day one of the exercise, and retired colonel, who's now a ham, that was heading it up, Colonel Hedgepeth, had mentioned to us or asked us how things were going, and we provided some feedback, and he offered us a challenge that the next day he wanted us to prove out communications off the base to local repeaters. So we came prepared for that. We added another 16 feet to the top of our HF mast, put a 2-meter Yagi up at the top, and proceeded to drill through the list of repeaters as per his request. So, like you say, putting up additional antennas is always an option, but we prefer the ability to just switch the coax to a different radio if we need to, and at least be able to be on the air immediately.
So how did you turn your Yagi? Did you just turn all the sections of your poles, or did you have a guy wire to pull it around?
We call that the Armstrong method.
Yes.
I'm not sure where I heard it at first. I didn't invent it, but we've kind of adopted that phrase that we'll tie a piece of fairly light line, whether that's paracord or something else. Something reflective is nice so that you can see it in the dark if you have to, just with a little reflective tracer through there. And you just turn it around to whichever direction you need to spin it.
Yeah, he was probably the guy in the ham group that was on field day that was assigned to run out in the rain. Grab a hold of the rope and
exactly.
turn it back as the wind blows.
Yeah, there is that. We actually at field day this year used that for our 6-meter station. We had a Moxon that we were using and rotating it through the same method, and it was windy enough that we actually had to stake it out. So if we needed to rotate the Moxon for 6 meters for field day, we'd haul over for the assistant to come, and he'd unstake it, rotate it the 40 or 50 degrees that we wanted it turned, and pound it back into the ground.
Yeah. So we kind of alluded this back and forth a little bit, but you use the military poles. Is that your primarily support structure for this exercise?
For this exercise, it was. We've got a lot of different tools in the toolbox, but the military mast is a favorite. And there's several different flavors out there. The ones that we use primarily are surplus, originally camouflage net poles is what they were designed as. And these are masts that come in a 4-foot length. If you go out and search on particularly eBay, or there's some commercial suppliers, Go Vertical USA is one that comes to mind. They've got kits that you can buy that will include multiples of that, but they'll come in both fiberglass and aluminum. On the fiberglass side, some have reinforced ends, some don't. There's pros and cons to both. Obviously, the aluminum's a little bit stronger, and the fiberglass has the benefit of being non-metallic.
Yeah, less conductive.
Non-conductive. So typically what we'll do is I like to use a mix. So if we're going to go up to, let's say, about 30 feet, which is kind of a sweet spot for my 40-80 inverted V, we'll go up 6 sections, which brings us up to 24 feet, all aluminum and then guy. And then the next section on top, or 2 sections on top, will be fiberglass. And that provides less of an opportunity for interaction with the mast. Even though there still is some, certainly, with the distances that are involved. But there's a lot of different options and opportunities there. So I mentioned there the inverted V, which is very similar to your design that you'd mentioned, where I've got 40 coming off one direction, 80 coming off the other, and cross-polarized to each other. That's been a favorite antenna. Works really, really well for us. We set up differently with the 60-meter dipole, where we had 3 sections. One on each end, bringing us up to 12 feet. The Go Vertical USA has some different tools. They've got a tripod base, and you'll see in the pictures on Facebook there that tripod base is pictured, and that's one method where you set up the tripod and then you just start pushing mast sections up through the center, and reach your ultimate height wherever you want it to be. We've always guide. There's pictures on there of unguided masts up to about 30 feet, and that's getting a little high for my taste.
Yeah.
So we like to guide it usually about 24 or 28 feet, and then we can continue on up to our ultimate height from there.
Yeah, I sacrificed an easy up with that tripod by guying it, and then I unguide, and it came down in a very uncontrolled manner. It took out my easy up, but the easy up jumped in the way. It took the grenade. It saved the mast.
Fall, huh?
Yeah, it took the fall. It broke the fall. So I didn't lose too much on that. But getting those up there, and that's one thing with the NVIS is 12 feet, 10 feet. At 4-foot sections, you just bring out 3 pieces. Certainly not a backpacking solution, but certainly for COMEX exercises and field day, these military poles are quite the treat, and you can get them at Army surplus stores or eBay. Luckily, we have a local operator here that works up in Idaho, and he goes up and hand picks them out of a surplus place up there. So they're pretty cost effective. So do you guy your NVIS antenna, or do you just let your 4 lines be the guy?
We've done both. We used to guy, like I said, up at about 24 feet with usually 3/8 polyester rope, bringing it down. And we found that once you guy up at the top, another 4 feet up, there's not a lot of tension on the guy lines. And so we have, in more of a field expedient manner, use the actual antenna as the guy.
Yeah.
And it works remarkably well.
Especially when
you get it up.
Yeah, when you're 12 feet off the ground. There's just not much there.
Well, and at 12 feet on that one, we used a little different design. We hooked the antenna on the guy ring, if you will, at 12 feet, and then we pulled back a single V with 2 guy lines back. So one side was really guyed via the antenna to the other mast, and vice versa, with a V coming off the back end. So
okay,
that worked pretty well for us.
And then, like we talked about, they're either in metal or plastic, do you find you have to get some grease or anything on those metal ones to keep them from binding together?
We've not had any issue with the bind. I will say, though, that if you're using the tripod method, where you're putting mass up through the center section, you'll want to make certain that you're using gloves. It's very easy to get a finger in there and get a little bite. But we've not had any issues with them sticking together. It's a nice fit, not too tight, but tight enough that it works pretty well.
Okay, before we wrap up, is there anything, what was your, like you said, your takeaway was digital modes. What other lessons did you learn that would help others understand?
Digital modes are obviously key. There's a lot of opportunity there for our served agencies. We want to dabble a little bit more in Arden as well, and getting into computer-to-computer traffic. Big message here is do it. As we've worked through these communications exercises, this was the fourth one that I've been involved with from the amateur side of things. And every time we've done it, we've found hiccups and kinks and bugs that we've had to work out. Everything from a particular agency may not have a PL tone programmed on their interoperable frequencies, making them useless. They don't have the ability to front panel program like we do. It's a trip to the radio shop or to their vendor to get those done. So biggest takeaway is do it. Get out there, be interoperable, establish the relationships with the served agencies, demonstrate your worth, and take their lead on their needs. And their needs may be different from what we're expecting. A lot of times the discussion is, well, I've got this ham radio and I'm going to talk on the ham frequencies. And as I highlighted there, we've got interoperable frequencies. We're operating in some cases on MERS frequencies with our local EMA. That's the multiple use radio service. We've got a project that's underway right now helping our emergency manager wire his EOC for cable TV. And certainly not in the ham realm, but it builds relationships and helps there. So that's really the key takeaway. Get out, do it, build the relationships, demonstrate your value, and take their lead.
That is really, really good information, especially, we just had David Goldenberg on, and he had the same messages. It's all about relationships and being a valuable asset, because the minute you become a negative, the agencies kind of figure out you don't need to be invited.
Exactly. You're done at that point, and potentially even undone years of relationship building that's been done in the past. These are folks that have a role to fill professionally, and it's very important that we respect that role and offer solutions, not problems for them.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, thank you, Paul, for coming on the show. KB7VML, thank you for giving us the breakdown on your interoperability exercise.
Absolutely. Thanks, John.
Thank you again, Paul, for coming on the show, and we look forward to having you on again to discuss more about how we get antennas up in the air. I mentioned at the top of the show that Chameleon Antenna is the sponsor of this show. If you are looking for a well-built, well-designed antenna for your field setup or even your home, please check them out at chameleonantenna.com or look in our show notes for a link. Now for our training item segment of the show. In this training item, I discuss the fog of war. All too often in emergency events, the initial information is scattered and rarely accurate. How can we as emergency communicators mitigate this issue? This training item may perhaps give you some direction. Hello, this is Don W7DBO with a training item, Communicating in a Fog of War. In everyday life, especially in emergency or disaster, there's always official channels of information and unofficial channels of information being relayed to the public. In public information officer training for government entities, they give a few key words of advice. First, the microphone is always live, and second, it will take over 24 hours to walk back one item of misinformation. When you hear of a situation unfolding, you naturally turn to media, and now social media, for information. In a recent local event with a school evacuation, both social media and local media was running with various stories of misinformation. You expect social media to be rampant with this misinformation, but unfortunately, in the race to be first, local media ran also with non-sourced information. So this led me to think about our role as communication specialists and our responsibility in being the conduit of information to decision makers. Prussian military analyst Karl von Clausewitz coined the phrase fog of war, in stating, "War is the reel of uncertainty. 3/4 of the factors on which action in war is based are wrapped in a fog of greater or lesser uncertainty. A sensitive and discriminating judgment is called for, a skilled intelligence to scent out the truth." More modern day, former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld stated, "There are known knowns, there are things we know that we know, there are known unknowns, that is to say, there are things we know we don't know, but there are also unknown unknowns. These things we don't know, we don't know. So how, as communication specialists, can we mitigate this fog of war in our role? We can prepare in advance to know and discern where official sources of information can be obtained. This can come in the form of emergency alerts on our phone or radios, official Twitter feeds from public safety or government officials, and access to official briefings. Document the information, time, and source so you can disseminate official information when asked. Second, understanding your position, you are an island in a sea of information. There are more things you do not know than you do know, and try not to be frustrated by that. Feel comfortable when asked to reply that you do not know the answer. Avoid the dangers of speculation or inference of non-verified facts. Depending on your organizational role, you may be asked only to communicate official messages. If that is your role, adhere to it strictly. When sending information, it is important to include the source of the information. Was it from an official leader, person on the street, or your own personal observation? It is important to convey the time lapse of the information since it may no longer be valid. For example, it would be appropriate to relay on an emergency net the following. At 10:15 hours today, an emergency alert was broadcast from the National Weather Service radio stating that I-15 was closed at mile marker 154 to southbound traffic. Notice this information sequence: time, source, information, and most importantly, no inference of why it's closed or perceived estimation of opening. Let the person receiving the information assimilate it for their decision making. Lastly, observe and document all that you see and hear. If you document all traffic on the radio that may not seem important at the time, it may be valuable in the future. In conclusion, our role as the conduit of information during a situation or disaster is to recognize that there is a fog of war, do our best to mitigate the unknown, and be prepared to convey accurate information as possible. This is John, W7DBO, with a training item. This will do it for this episode. Thank you, Cowley KB7VML, for coming on the show. It's great to have listeners come forward to share their story of real-world communications fieldwork. If you would like to be a guest on the show or want a certain topic covered on the show, please contact me at john, John, at hamradio360.com. Thank you once again for Chameleon Antenna for sponsoring this episode. As always, please send me your comments, feedback, and show ideas to john at hamradio360.com. 73.